We got 5 points in chapter 9. Death of joy, we talked about the last week. We'll talk about it one more time today. Exiles from their land, loss of spiritual discernment, declining birth rates, and cast out. All right, verse 1. Do not rejoice, O Israel. Do not be jubilant like the other nations, for you have been unfaithful to your God. You love the wages of a prostitute at every threshing floor. So what's happening here? Just quickly, this threshing floor business has to do with the harvest, and what's happening is their harvest is either going to decline or turn to nothing, and they're not being told, they're not being commanded not to rejoice. What I told you last week was they're just not going to be able to rejoice because there's not going to be anything to rejoice about because the harvest is going to be so bad. Verse 2, threshing floors and wine presses will not feed the people. The new wine will fail them. It just means the crops are going to fail. And this really has to do with them giving Baal all the credit for what God did. Baal was the Canaanite god of fertility. And so when they start mixing these two, Baal and Yahweh, remember, is another name for God, then what they did, it got to where they couldn't tell the two apart. And so whenever something good from God came, they were giving the credit to Baal. God didn't like that, basically. Okay, so that brought us down to verse 3, and it brought us into another section there of exile from the land. So let me read verse 3. They will not remain in the Lord's land. Ephraim will return to Egypt and eat unclean food in Assyria. The land belongs to the Lord. There's scripture to say that. You can look at Exodus and Leviticus, but the land belonged to the Lord, who was responsible for its fertility. He owns it. He's responsible for it. The food, or it's talking about here, they're going to be eating unclean food. The food that Israel will eat in captivity will be unclean on the basic assumption that the Lord's land is clean in the ritual sense of the holy and the common. All other is unclean. Therefore, in captivity, all food will be unclean because they will not be in the land. They're going to be out of the land. They're going to be in exile. They'll still be eating, but everything they eat will be considered unclean because they will not be in the Lord's land anymore. Verse 4 says, they will not pour out wine offerings to the Lord, nor will their sacrifices please him. Such sacrifices will be to them like the bread of mourners. All who eat them will be unclean. This food will be for themselves. It will not come into the temple of the Lord. Remember, we're talking about exile from their land. Okay, these are sacrifices that talked about here in reference to the Torah. They will not be able to perform those sacrifices, but if they do, it will be with unclean food. Ritually unclean food, because they're not going to be in the land, they're not going to be in the temple. In exile, opportunity for legitimate worship to the Lord will end. So they're going to be in a situation where everything revolved around the temple, everything revolved around sacrifices. They're not going to have a temple. They're not going to be able to make sacrifices in the way the Levitical law says they're supposed to do it. So everything they're going to do with the worship to the Lord is going to come to an end. This was highly appropriate since Israel's Levitical worship had been corrupted by hypocrisy. There will be no temple, for the food will be for them alone, not for worship. The food they get, which they eat, is just that, just food to eat. A nation that refuses to conduct its formal worship in the proper spirit would be denied the privilege of worship. That's what's happening to them. Okay, they didn't worship the correct way, so God took it away. He did not validate their worship in any way when they were mixing their stuff, their beliefs with Baal. So he just took it away. Verse 5. Verse 5. What will you do on the day of your appointed feast, on the festival days of the Lord? Now that's an interesting question. That is a rhetorical question. What will you do on those days, on those feast days, on those worship days, on all those days that you do? It's rhetorical. What will you do? Nothing. It's going to all be invalid. We just talked about it. All the food that you have will be unclean, so you can't worship with that. You're not going to have a place to worship. You don't keep the law, so you can't worship. You're going to be out of the land, so it'll be impossible to worship in the way that you're supposed to be able to do it. You'll be unable to celebrate. There will be no worship for joyous festivals, nor for the solemn festivals. So what will you do on those days? It's impossible for us, or for modern. Think about us now and our understanding of this. It's impossible for us as modern readers to understand the utter loss Hosea implies in this question. This is why it is important to study every verse of the Bible. This would probably, how could you study Hosea and just choose the important verses? I mean, which ones are not important? When we studied chapter 4 and chapter 5, those are some of the darkest things I think I've ever read in the Bible. Let's talk about the priest and how unworthy they were to lead worship. They were the reason that the people had no knowledge of God. It said chapter 4 verse 1 said that they had no faithfulness, no truthfulness, they had no covenant love, and they had no knowledge of God. All of that was because of the priests. They were so bad. You read all about chapter 4 and chapter 5, you get a very good picture of how bad the priests really were. This is another case. Without reading every one of these verses, you don't really get a good idea of what we're talking about with the invalid worship practices that the people were going through. So anyway, that takes us to verse 7. No, not verse 6. 7. Verse 6. What was that, 5 I just read? Yes, sir. Well, let's study 6 then. See, we have to do every verse. We can't skip any verses.
You did just
say that. I was just checking you. Checking you.
Got it.
Verse 6. Yeah, verse 6. Yeah, don't let me go to sleep up here, whatever you do. Verse 6. Even if they escape from destruction, Egypt will gather them, and Memphis will bury them. Their treasures of silver will be taken over by briars, and thorns will overrun their tents. For the most part, this verse is idiomatic. Egypt is used for bondage. As in the days of the Exodus, they will once again be going into bondage under Assyria. Memphis is used for death. It's a town, I could not get a lot of information about this, but it's a town of ancient Egypt which no longer exists above ground. It's been extinct for so long that it's been covered over for so many eons of time that it's just completely underground. But the NIV application commentary calls it the graveyard of Egypt. So that's what this is talking about. Israel will not be gathered in Egypt for salvation. We talked about the gathering. In our verse of the week, chapter 11, verse 11, we talked about the regathering. A lot of times you talk about the regathering in the Old Testament, you're talking about a positive thing for salvation where God regathers the Jews. This is not one of those times. This has to do with with judgment. They're going to be gathered in Egypt for judgment, for bondage, and for death. About the gold and the silver being covered over by briars and thorns, all of these things they value, and the places where people live in their tents will be overrun by weeds and briars. Why is that? Why is there all their houses, all their gold, all their silver, metaphorically, why is it all going to be covered over with weeds?
Because they're worshiping incorrectly?
No, it's because they're in exile. They're gone. Their house is left behind. Their farmland's left behind. And everything is just, it's going to be unattended. It's just going to be grown over by weeds. On another note, what is your money worth when you go into captivity?
Depends on what material it's made out of, I guess.
Yeah, and if it's gold, you don't get to keep it.
Right.
Right? If it's dollar bills, it'll be worth it. If worthless. If we went into captivity, our money wouldn't be worth anything. And that's what happened when Jerusalem was overrun by Babylon. They were told your money. A time is coming when your money's going to be worthless. Yes, sir.
I heard Les Belden talk about I can't pull the name out now. Anyway, back in 1860, I took the trip to Israel to see what everything looked like. Mark Twain. He said he had never seen such a desolate place in his life. So you go all day long and see nothing but desert, and maybe one nomad or some desert fox or something. But it was just utterly deserted and desolate, nothing growing. It wasn't green and prosperous like the promised land. That's what he's talking about here. And that's how it was. But it changed around the turn of the century when the Jews started going back and building the land. Look at it today. It is prosperous now. There's green gardens. The country looks nice. It's prospering because the Jew is back in the land. That's the only reason it's prospering. God would not allow it otherwise.
I like that. I'm going to I hope I remember that you said that when I get to the point where I have a comment about that very thing. This was 1860, something like that is what you're talking about. There was no hope of Israel ever getting back into the land in 1860. They didn't get back in until 1948. It became a nation state. I guess they were going back before that time, but until 1948, there was just no hope for it. No consideration was ever even given to it. So even if this reference to Egypt and Memphis is not idiomatic, the results are the same. Those who flee Assyria to Egypt will find nothing but famine and death. So that's what's coming. Captivity and exile is what's going to happen. Verse 7. Now I can do verse 7. Is it to do verse 7 now? Okay.
We'll allow it.
The days of punishment are coming. The days of reckoning are at hand. Let Israel know this, because your sins are so many and your hostility so great. The prophet is considered a fool, the inspired man a maniac. That's a long verse. The contempt for the prophets is a lot of the reason for the judgments. If they hated the prophets, it was because of what? Why did they hate the prophets?
Kept reminding them of how much they were, turning away from God.
They didn't like the message. I just don't like your message. I'm going to kill you. And that's what they did many times. Took them out and killed them. The message was politically incorrect. What does politically incorrect mean in the way we use it today?
Doesn't go along with the culture.
It doesn't go along with the culture. And these prophets come in, and that's what they're saying stuff that doesn't go along with the culture. We're wealthy. We talked about in the beginning how prosperous the northern kingdom was. We're prosperous. We don't believe this stuff that you're saying.
There's a theologian out of the Portland area who talks about it. The prophets were the attorneys for God's will, and so if you think about the attorney on the other side, I mean, how much do you typically hate them when they're trying to find a way to show how you are wronging their client? Like, they're showing you all the angles of where your kind of relationship is broken and how it's your fault. That they didn't like that, and he kind of modernizes it of we do that to attorneys all the time when they're trying to be the representative of the law in that moment, to say, hey, this is how you are wronging my client, and this is how this relationship you had that you agreed to have, you're breaking it. And just I thought it was a great metaphor, because I think a lot of times when we hear prophet, we think, oh, they're only like future casting, but in a lot of ways, what you see so often is, and I think Hosea is a perfect example of being that I'm in the moment and I'm showing you how you are breaking the deal. It's on you.
That is a very good example, because what the prophet does is bring the indictment.
Right.
He brings the indictment, and the other people say, you're crazy. We're going to take you out and kill you. It's more than just having a rational discussion about it. They really wanted to kill him. Okay, so if they hated the prophet, it's because of the message. This message was from God, so they hated God too. And these guys really did. I mean, they literally hated God. This is similar to what was encountered by Amos when he was preaching against Israel. He was met by a man named Amaziah, the head of the northern kingdom religious establishment, who regarded his words as treacherous, who regarded Amos's words as treacherous, and who arranged for his dismissal as a prophet. Of course, you can't dismiss one of God's prophets, but that guy thought he could. Jeremiah had similar treatment. If you read Jeremiah 29:26, he had to put up with the same kind of stuff. But even Jesus himself was accused of being demon-possessed by those who disagreed with his teaching. Look over to John 7. Let's flip over there real quick. John 7. Thought that was interesting. John 7. John 7, verse 16 to 20. Let me just read it. We'll just see if I've already said what this verse says. I don't know if it. Jesus answered, in verse 16, Jesus answered, my teaching is not my own. It comes from him who sent me. If anyone chooses to do God's will, he will find out whether my teaching comes from God or whether I speak on my own. He who speaks on his own does so to gain honor for himself, but he who works for the honor of the one who sent him is a man of truth. There is nothing false about him. Has not Moses given you the law? Yet no one of you keeps the law. Why are you trying to kill me? And he goes on to verse 20 and says, the people said, you are demon-possessed. Who is trying to kill you? They did not like Jesus' message. Just like prophets. They did not like the prophet's messages. They did not like Jesus' message. What did they want to do to him? They want to kill him. All right. Let's look at verse 8. Verse 8. The prophet, well, we're into another section here, loss of spiritual discernment. The prophet, along with my God, is the watchman over Ephraim, yet snares await him on all his paths, and hostility in the house of his God. Hostility is also used also used in verse 8. It refers to intense animosity towards God. The ungodly disregard God. They disobey God when his will is made known to them. When they recognize it's his will, they disobey it. They despise God when he chooses to judge them. That's what was happening with the prophets. They were bringing this message in. They didn't like the message. Therefore, they didn't like God. Another was a watchman was responsible for warning a city of an approaching enemy. In the same way, God's prophets were to warn the people of coming judgment of sin, and that's what they didn't like. You know, they're the watchmen. They talked about it in Ezekiel. Ezekiel was called a watchman in Ezekiel 33, I think, 33:6. But Israel showed great hostility and hatred, it says, and tried to ensnare the prophets God had placed as watchmen over this nation. Note that the hostility was in the house of God. It said the hostility was in the house of God. This means throughout the whole land. I mean, I think the house of God there is a metaphor for the whole land. It's his land, and this hostility was shown throughout the whole house of God. Countrywide hostility toward God and the prophets. Okay, so let's look at verse 9. Oh yeah, verse 9. This will gross you up. They have sunk deep into corruption, as in the days of Gibeah. God will remember their wickedness and punish them for their sins. Y'all know anything about Gibeah?
No.
You're about to find out. Huh? No, this is worse. This is Judges 19 to 21. Let me just tell you. Yeah, go ahead and find it. I'm going to summarize it as we go. It's too much to cover, but it's. Let me get it too. This is some of the grossest stuff in the Bible. One of the most sordid stories in the Old Testament are the days of Gibeah. That's just Judges 19 to 21. Gibeah was a town occupied by the tribe of Benjamin. Okay? And it became a symbol for the terrible deeds done there. You know, that's what we've been seeing as we're going through here. We saw it, same thing happened when we studied Jude. They pulled out these Old Testament examples of things that happened to say this is how the people are now. And this is what he's doing here. He's pulling out this situation in Gibeah to say the people are at least that bad, maybe even worse. During the days of the judges, a Levite traveling, and he was unable to reach his home, so he sought shelter for himself and his concubine in Gibeah. Now, I don't understand why a Levite was traveling with a concubine, but he was. And he couldn't get home, so he found a place to stay. And while he was there, a band of depraved men gathered around the house and outside the host's house and desired homosexual relations with a guest, the Levite. They said, send him out. Sounds a lot like what happened.
A lot.
Yeah, a lot in Sodom and I guess it was Sodom. But the host delivered the concubine to them instead. And she was used all night and left on the doorstep dead. I guess Jan knew what was coming, so she left.
Yeah.
Let me read those first few verses. No, I won't. I'm not going to read it. Okay, so she's left. She's used all night long with these guys, and it ends up killing her. She dies from it. Left her on the doorstep. The Levite took her body home. Have you read that yet? Did you read ahead?
Mm-hmm.
Cut her body into 12 pieces, and sent the 12 pieces to each of the 12 tribes of Israel. You ever read anything like that? This act of sending the parts did exactly what the Levite wanted, and that was to shock the nation. There's a lot of stuff in here, 3 chapters long. You can read that and see it for yourself if you think that's what he wanted to do, was shock the nation. That's what I've got written here. The shock succeeded. They rallied and attacked the tribe of Benjamin and almost wiped the whole tribe out. They only left, this is hard to believe, it's hard to understand. They only left 600 people alive out of the whole tribe of Benjamin, or at least the whole tribe that lived in this area. They left 600 people. This was a big drive to get, then after that, which is really not part of our story, but because, with only 600 people, the tribe of Benjamin was in danger of not being able to reproduce to the point where they could survive and exist. So there was a drive to get wives for all of them. Okay, that's in there. We're not going to cover it, but just a kind of an aside comment. But the atrocities and the near wipeout of the tribe of Benjamin was indicative of the low point of the people of the times. On occasion, it was said, such a thing has never been seen or done, not since the day of that the Israelites came out of Egypt. It is included in the book of Judges to be idiomatic of just how horrible the circumstances were that had occurred. All right, this is a bad, terrible situation. All through the book of Judges, you find a phrase that says, every man did what was right in his own eyes. In fact, I think the very last verse of Judges says that.
Yeah.
On the surface, it sounds pretty good, if everybody has good, discernment to know what's good, great. The problem is that's not what the context was. The context was they just did what they wanted to do, good, bad, or otherwise. Okay, out of the context it sounds fine, but in the context of the book of the Judges and the way it is all throughout the Bible, it is the deepest part of their immorality. It's the most immoral you can be when everyone did what was right in their own eyes. You want to commit adultery? Hey, that's all right. We'll just go do that. You want to steal from your neighbor? Nobody's watching. I'll just go do that. That's the kind of situation we're talking about. So Gibeah tends to be idiomatic of that low, shocking immorality. And he says over in Hosea, and that's how you are. What Hosea is saying is that even Gibeah has been outdone by the sins of Israel and her regard for the God of the universe. So terrible as that situation was in Gibeah, you're worse. That's what the prophet's saying. That's the end of verse. Was that verse 9?
Yes, sir.
Okay, well that's the end of these notes. I got some more notes. Do the rest of the chapter. Verse 10. Verse 2, oops, I've got to get back. when I found Israel, it was like finding grapes in the desert. When I saw your fathers, it was like seeing the early fruit of the fig tree on the fig tree. But when they came to Baal Peor, they consecrated themselves to that shameful idol and became as vile as the thing they loved. All right. Well, you missed out on all the carving up of the prostitute or the concubine that senator parts around the countryside. You missed all that. If you want to talk about that when we get home, we'll go through it. Okay. This action begins with reference to Israel's origins, where the Lord found great delight in the nation. When he looked at them with delight, he looked at them as grapes in the desert would be an unsuspected source of surprise and delight, because you don't find grapes growing wild in the desert. But that's how he saw them, as an unexpected pleasure. The delicious early fruit of the fig tree was irresistible. However, the attitude toward his people, God's attitude towards his people soon changed. When they arrived at Peor, the place where they worshiped Baal, they engaged in sexual immorality with Moabite women as part of the fertility rites associated with the worship of Baal of Peor. This deity, which God called, I'm getting ahead. Flip over to Numbers 25. This is going to be a review because we've talked about this before when we studied Balaam. Numbers 25. This went along with when we studied Balaam. When we were talking about Jude, Balaam was part of the stuff that, one of the Old Testament things that Jude drew from to talk about the people. But this is just kind of a reminder. I'll just read it, give you the big summaries, the first 9 verses of Numbers 25. While Israel was staying in Shittim, the men began to indulge in sexual immorality with Moabite women, who invited them to the sacrifices of their gods. The people ate and bowed down before these gods, so Israel joined in worshiping the Baal of Peor, and the Lord's anger burned against them. The Lord said to Moses, "Take all the leaders of these people, kill them, and expose them in broad daylight before the Lord, so the Lord's fierce anger may burn away from Israel." So Moses said to Israel's judges, "Each of you must put to death those of your men who have joined in worshiping the Baal of Peor." Those of your men, those Israelites who got with Moabite women. That's what he's talking about. Then the Israelite man brought to his family a Midianite woman right before the eyes of Moses and the whole assembly of Israel, while they were weeping at the entrance of the tent of meeting. When Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, saw this, he left the assembly, took a spear in his hand, and allowed the Israelites into the tent. He drove the spear through both the man, through the Israelite, and into the woman's body. Then the plague against the Israelites stopped, but those who died of the plague, number 24,000. So, just as a reminder, Balaam got the blame for that. We're not going to go through that, but nevertheless, that's the event that he's talking about here in verse 10. He said that the Moabite women encouraged the Israelite men to participate in the fertility rites to Baal. Okay? And God said that's not acceptable. We need to take everybody out and kill them. So the deity which God called the shameful idol, it's called the shameful idol in the NIV. In the King James, it's called that shame. I don't know what it's called in the ESV and the New American Standard, but it's talking about this idol, the Baal that they worshipped at Peor. It may have been, what I've read is it may not be the Baal that we were talking about all through Hosea. It may just be the local Baal, the local Baal god of the area that's worshipped at Peor. But nevertheless, this event in Moses' day was mentioned here because it set the pattern for Israel's subsequent history characterized by unfaithfulness. They started here and it just got worse. It's also mentioned in Psalm 106. Let's go look at that. Psalm 106. I did not know this. Psalm 106, verses 28 to 30. I can just read it. I'll read because we're going to go read some more stuff after this. They yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor and ate sacrifices offered to lifeless gods. They provoked the Lord to anger by their wicked deeds, and a plague broke out among them. But Phinehas stood up and intervened, and the plague was checked. So when Phinehas stabbed the Israelite man and the Midianite woman, he ended that business with the plague. But it goes on and talks about all kinds of things in ensuing verses, talking about child sacrifices. Over in 37, they sacrificed their sons and their daughters. They shed innocent blood, the blood of their sons and daughters. They sacrificed to the idols of Canaan, and so on and so forth. Then you get down to verse 43, and it says, many times he delivered them, but they were bent on rebellion, and they wasted away in their sin. So we've been talking about, seemed like last week we talked a lot about them wasting away. They got into these situations where they were not worshiping God, and as a result of that, they just wasted it away. They wasted away in their money, they wasted away in their military defenses, they wasted away in their health. We're seeing they're wasting away in their birth rates. We're going to see that as we go on here. But there was that was just something that came up, and I thought you might want to see that in Psalm 106. In Hosea's day, Israel had also defiled herself, making Baal her lover, and like the generation at Peor, they too had engaged in fertility rites. They engaged in sexual immorality under the banner of religious ceremony. Okay, that's what part of this is about. They're mixing all of these pagan rites with the worship of Yahweh, and they turned it into just sexual immorality in the name of worship is what we're talking about. Okay, the end of verse 10, it says, and they became as vile as the thing they loved. They became as vile as the thing they worshiped. We talked about this once before. We become like the gods we worship. If we worship materialistic, harsh, and unforgiving gods, we become materialistic, harsh, and unforgiving. You remember talking about that? If we worship a cold, impersonal, and unresponsive God, we become cold, impersonal, and unresponsive. We become like the God we worship. This is why it is so important that we worship Christ. We will become like Christ eventually if we worship Him. To worship Him, you have to understand what that means. To worship Him means that we must take up our cross daily and follow Him. It requires daily commitment. To worship Christ requires daily commitment. Take up your cross daily and follow Him. If you are not taking up your cross, you are not worshiping. It's about that simple. If you are not worshiping, if you're not taking up your cross, if you're not responding to situations and to God and the way Christ would respond to him, you are not worshiping. And that is not just being in church on Sunday, it is daily. Work where you work, where you play bridge, where you do water aerobics, wherever you are, in the grocery store where the ladies muscle her way up in line, wherever you are, if you're not taking up your cross daily and following Christ, you are not worshiping, and you will not become like him until you can start doing that. You don't just wake up one day and find yourself to be like Christ. It is an active thing. It requires attention and it requires deliberate action. Romans 12:2. Somebody find it for me and read it. Romans 12:2. You ought to know it by memory. I'll just tell you what it says. The last part of the verse says, do not conform, but be transformed. Remember that? Do not be conformed to the ways of the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. You have to change the way you think. If you're going to worship Christ, you have to change the way you think. Okay? And it's a daily thing. You can't say, okay, it's Sunday, I got to think about Christ now. It's a daily thing. All week long. It's taking up your cross and following him. We become like the God we worship. You got to remember that. Whatever it is you worship. Ephesians got a long list of it. Ephesians 5:5, a long list of things that are God's. Greed, sexual immorality. There's 5 or 6 things listed there. Colossians 3:5's got another list of things that we don't ordinarily think of as God's, but Paul makes it clear they are. And they're all conditions of the heart and the mind. You have to renew your mind. You have to change the way you think. Okay? Verse 11. Ephraim's glory will fly away like a bird. No birth, no pregnancy, no conception. It's pretty clear. Hosea, conception, birth, and children are to be taken away. Hosea, as no other writer of ancient times, traces results of national immorality to a declining population. If you don't study every verse of this chapter, that's probably one verse you're not going to study. All right? By the way, many of the ancient nations regarded abortion as a capital crime against the state. I didn't know that. All I hear about is child sacrifice, and giving up of babies and all those things. But if you were caught killing a child, you were put to death in some of the nations. They considered it a capital offense. They knew that the strength of a nation was a function of their population growth, and if you got in the way of that population growth, you were injuring the interest of the state. Killing babies was not acceptable. Killing children, sacrificing children was not acceptable. They and their pagan perceptions were closer to the mark on the point that we are in today. We kill lots of babies. We abort lots of babies. I hear phenomenal numbers if you read about it. They're numbers that are so large as to almost be unbelievable. And I didn't look to see what they are, but I mean, I've read them before, I've heard them before, and it's an incredible thing.
It's interesting though to kind of think about the motivation of either side of that, because in what you're just talking about, the motivation at its purest form was just to grow the nation, right? Didn't have really anything to do with the worshipful act of caring for an image bearer of God. It's, we got to grow the nation, and so if you get in the way of that, then that's why it's illegal. And then you come over here in today's world, particularly in the U.S., it's, well, we don't want to get in the way of personal freedom.
Oh yeah.
And independence and your choice and those kinds of things, and for the good of the nation, right? Because the nation's built on personal freedom, and so we we rationalize it to say, well, that's why we allow for that to happen, is because it's personal freedom. And so neither one really at its core. One happens to have a result that we as Christians like, but neither one are at the root of it or have the right motivation. It's not for God's glory. And so it's just kind of interesting to think about it, that again, we got to look at the heart of any acts that we do that might happen to have a result that we like, but is it ever really truly with the right heart?
Okay. Ephraim is used idiomatically for the whole northern kingdom. We talked about another name for the northern kingdom is Israel. We're finding also that many times it's referred to as Ephraim. That's the largest tribe in the northern kingdom, and sometimes it's referred to in that way. The name Ephraim is used in verses 11, 13, and 16 because it was associated with fertility and fruitfulness. The irony is that the name of the northern kingdom means the name of Ephraim means fruitfulness. And that is if you look at that's in Genesis 41, 52, we won't go look at it, but that was what Ephraim had as a definition for the name. It means fruitfulness. As punishment for Israel's sin and involvement in the Baal fertility rites, the Lord would bring on the curse of infertility in verse, we talked about the blessings and the curses. And the curses of infertility in verses 11 and 14 brings on death in verses 12 and 13 and exile in verse 15 and 17. All because of this question of giving credit to Baal for the fertility of the nation rather than on God. He said, I'm taking it away. I'm taking it away. Verse 12, I read verse 12. Even if they rear children, I will bereave them of everyone. Woe to them when I turn away from them. Verse 12. It is Yahweh. This goes back to what I didn't want to forget, Wayne. You were talking about the land. When the people were out of it, when God was out of it, what did it look like? Dust bowl.
Desolation.
Desolation. It is Yahweh, Yahweh's vital presence that makes possible the cycle of life. If He is not in it, it's affected. Those who had tried to secure fertility through Baal worship would become sterile. That's what we're talking about, be sterile or barren. Verse 13, let's see. The Israelites will not have successful pregnancies. Even if they do, the child will not survive. All right, verse 13. I have seen Ephraim like Tyre, planted in a pleasant place, but Ephraim will bring out their children to the slayer. Tyre was, we're into declining birth rates now, by the way. Tyre was the commercially prosperous center. Metaphorically, it had been placed in a pleasant place like a meadow. It's where the money was. Yay, that's where I want to be. I'll run and play in the meadow. I'll run and play in Tyre. That's where the money is. God had not judged Tyre yet. That doesn't really happen until Babylon, but it was at least at a time of great commercial. It was a great commercial center. Its prosperity was like a fever, and it had caught on with the northern kingdom. The northern kingdom and Tyre were both prosperous commercial centers. Lots and lots of money was there. There was false prosperity in the northern kingdom, and the people were deceived by it, just like we are. We're deceived by prosperity. The children, verse 13b said, Ephraim will bring out their children to the slayer. The children will be brought out as prey to the slayer, namely Baal. They were sacrificing their children, so God will hand the northern kingdom over to their enemies as a sacrifice. Everything we're seeing here, because they do one thing, God does the same thing in judgment. Verse 14, give them, O Lord, what you will give them. Give them wounds that miscarry and breasts that are dry. This is intercessory on Hosea's part, but it is not intercessory prayer for mercy, because they attributed their fertility to Baal. Barrenness is the only appropriate judgment for Israel. So that's what they get. You ought to give credit to Baal for fertility. I'm going to take your fertility away. All right, verse 15. Because of their wickedness in Gilgal, this is really interesting. This brought something home to me that I didn't really realize. He's pulling out, he's going back in time. He's going to pull something out of the Old Testament history, like he's done in Jude, like we've been seeing. Because of all their wickedness in Gilgal, I hated them there. Because of their sinful deeds, I will drive them out of my house. I will no longer love them. All their leaders are rebellious. What happened at Gilgal, what happened there stood for historic rebellion against God in two things. One was the establishment of a human monarchy. That's where they said, we want a king, because everybody else has a king, and they anointed Saul as their first king. That's the first thing that happened there. The other thing was a current spiritual rebellion in the shrine of Baal. The human monarchy, Saul's reign was inaugurated there, 1 Samuel 11, 14 to 15. I said read it. I wonder why I want to read it. 1 Samuel 11, verse 14 and 15. Then Samuel said to the people, come, let us go to Gilgal, and there affirm the kingship. That's what I want you to see. So all the people went to Gilgal and confirmed Saul as king in the presence of the Lord. There they sacrificed fellowship offerings before the Lord, and Saul and all the Israelites held a great celebration. So that happened at Gilgal, where he was, I guess, inaugurated, whatever you want to call it. The current rebellion at the shrine of Baal also happened at Gilgal, and that was Amos 4:4. Oh, there was something else I wanted to tell you. 1 Samuel 12, 17a. Yeah, this is what I wanted to, this is where I was really surprised. You know, God wanted judges for them. They said, we want a king so we can be like everybody else. Okay, well, I did not really realize how upset God was about that, because that was early in the days. You know, that was back before David was king. But it was really early in the days of Israel. You know, lots of stuff happened after that. Here's what it said in verse 12, verse 17a. And you will realize what an evil thing you did in the eyes of the Lord when you asked for a king. That's what Samuel said. God considered it a very evil thing. That's not just like saying, okay, I'll give you what you want. I'll give you what you want, and what you want is very evil in the way I look at things. Okay, the current situation, oh, it's after 12. I guess I ought to wrap up here. the current situation at the shrine of Baal at Gilgal is talked about in Amos 4:4. Find that pretty quick. It says, "Go to Bethel and sin, go to Gilgal and sin yet more. Bring your sacrifices every morning, your tithes every 3 years," so on and so forth. The altar for Baal made people sin because it was something that was not related to God. They went to Baal, the shrine of Baal, to make offerings. And if you're making an offering to a god and God is not in it, you're breaking the second commandment. God says through Hosea that he hated them there, and he will no longer love them. I kind of combine those two into one thing, but it says it has to do with the rejection of God. James 4:4 says, "Anyone who chooses to be a friend of the world," in other words, in choosing the world over God, becomes an enemy of God. And that's where that comes from, I believe. He hates the sin in our life. And it's hard to see how God hates people, but we are his enemy. If we reject God, we become God's enemy. And that's what they did. If you study the early chapters of Hosea, when they were rejecting God, he said, "I do not love you." I'm not sure he used the word hate there, but he's using it here. Because you've rejected me. Okay, so we'll stop at verse 15. We're nearly through, but we'll just start next week at verse 16.